Top of the Props is brought to you by Barkingham Palace Dog Grooming at Lemire, 1/10 Holiday Road, Lemire, where every pups are king or queen. Find them on Facebook, Barkingham Palace Dog Grooming, Macarthur. If you'd like to sponsor Top of the Props, contact us, the 81st Minute at outlook.com. And we're now into episode 8 of Top of the Props, and we've taken a few weeks to get him on, and he's been gracious enough tonight to speak to us. He's a man that represented Australia 14 times, 8 times for his home state of Queensland. He played over 200 NRL games. It's David Shillington. G'day, mate. How are you?
G'day, Curtis. Good, thanks, mate. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for coming on. We'll jump right in. And the thing that catches my eye straight away, doing a bit of research today, before chatting to you this evening, 2 older brothers, 1 little brother. How much scrapping and football was played in the backyard in Brisbane in the Shillington household back in the day?
Oh, an unbelievable amount. Seriously,
yeah.
It was pretty full on. I don't know if you remember the old Van Damme movies, Bloodsport, but
Yes.
it was a bit like that. In the 90s, growing up in my house, and Mum and Dad got a bit cranky at us a few times and told us to settle down, probably more times than they can remember. But yeah, I wouldn't change it for anything. I credit sort of having all my brothers and that sort of rough and tumble play to being able to, I guess, handle the knocks of the NRL later in life. All my brothers were definitely overgrown kids, overgrown teenagers, started lifting weights early and just matured and developed much faster than everybody else we knew. And so, yeah, they gave me a flogging many times, but it was probably a good thing.
Oh, and I was going to bring this up right at the end, but folks, if you get a chance, jump on YouTube after listening to Top of the Props with David Shillington. I just searched David Shillington fights on YouTube. There's 4 of them. Gallen, there's one with Hegarty, there's a very good one with Isaac Luke in a test match, and Adam Blair, which is not the best footage. But what I saw from that, and even before that, from memory, watching you play, and I would have been mid-20s in the mid-2000s kind of thing, having a look and watching you play. Memory was how short and flush and clean your punches were. And I know we shouldn't be talking about punches, and are you still employed by the NRL? Is that right? I don't know how much you can say, but and obviously fighting is now a no-go in the game. But that's the memory in my head was maybe it had something to do with having to, play that backyard footy in Brisbane back in the day against your brothers, and you had to kind of defend yourself a little bit. Everyone I speak to says, great bloke, very well spoken, obviously doing great things for the game post-football. But where did you learn to throw those little ones like that? Because they were always really, really clean and really short and quick.
It is a bit funny talking about it now because years later I work in well-being.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to talk about it.
No, it's fine. Look, those were the times back then. You did have the odd punch-up on the field, and it was mostly acceptable, I guess. Yeah. And I never went around looking for a fight, but
exactly.
It does happen on the field. When people try and stand over you, you take objection to it, of course. I'm glad the one with Paul Gallen wasn't later in his career when he became a bona fide boxer. I know I got a call late in my career and asked if I actually do a boxing match with Paul Gallen, one of those charity matches, and I think they're offering a fair bit of money at the time, and I hung up and I was chatting to my mates down the Raiders there and said, "Oh, do you reckon I should do a charity match versus Paul Gallen? That'd be all right, wouldn't it?" And someone goes, "Oh, have you watched his last fight versus Bodine Thompson?" I said, "No, I've never seen him fight at all." And we YouTubed it in the dressing rooms, and he did about a 15, 20 punch combo on Bodine and cleaned him up. And I went, "Yeah, I might give that one a miss, actually, and wait for the next competitor." Because the thing about boxing is you only take on people you can actually beat. So
yeah, true.
That wasn't going to be the case with Paul. But, I did make a few highlight reels there, and but certainly didn't go around looking for it. It's just what happened back in the day.
Yeah, and look, you like you mentioned too, you didn't go looking for it. You weren't a dirty player, David, by any stretch of the imagination at all, and you really. You got through your work and you had that big frame, that big body. Before we get to that, so you talked about your brothers, they started weights early. Was that part of your growing up too, being like your big brothers? And did that help you pick up a contract early with the Roosters?
Yeah, so we all very football orientated family. But in saying that, mum and dad also prioritised their schoolwork, and whilst my brothers were quite good athletes, they were pretty good at school too. So mum and dad made sure we had a lot of balance like that and had the right priorities front of mind.
Yep.
But absolutely, my brothers played a big role, and I love talking about it. And they played a big role in my career. And early on, actually in my mid-teens, I had a knee reconstruction, and it really put me behind the eight ball, I guess, trying to build my rugby league career. And I was pretty average teenager, and wasn't one of those teenage sensations. But so I sort of traded off my brother's names, to be honest, their last name, and I got to sort of survived in different teams and got picked for different things just because I had the last name of Shillington, thanks to my older brothers.
Yep.
And then when I was just finishing up school, ended up having a couple of trial games with the Roosters and the Raiders, clubs I both went on to play for.
Yep.
But at the time, I chose a contract with the Roosters and kicked off my career with them. So, and then moving through my career, and even still today, my brothers were huge influences on me, and I knew I could always ring them for a bit of honest feedback on games. You know, sometimes when you're a player, you get a lot of people, backslapping you through the good and bad games and not being completely honest with you. But they were always quite brutally honest at different times, which I really appreciated.
And when you did agree to sign with the Roosters, how quickly did you have to move out of Brisbane down to Sydney?
It wasn't too quick for me, actually, and which is what I wanted. Because, like I said, I certainly wasn't a teenage sensation, and I was just rebuilding my, I guess, football career after my knee reco. But the Roosters decided to take a punt on me, and they said, "Oh, look, we'll give you a scholarship." At the time, the Redcliffe Dolphins here in Brisbane, they were the feeder club for the Roosters, and the Roosters placed me at Redcliffe for a year. And I really used that year as a bit of a breakout year for me to be around more senior players and play my first senior footy, and from that I earned my Roosters actual contract, I guess, and moved down the following year. So I had a year of grace after school to build my career and hang out with my mates, start uni, and then finally moved down to the big smoke.
So did you go straight? So how old were you when you went into that season with Redcliffe? Did you go straight into first grade in the QRL?
Yeah, I was 17, so I just turning 18 later that year.
Yep.
I remember my dad was always really proud of me because the commentators, when I was playing Queensland Cup, were like, it's pretty rare that someone can wear their age on the back of their jersey. Number 17, first grade at Redcliffe, and then I was 17 at the time as well. So it was. I loved my time at Redcliffe. It was funny because, and I don't know if a lot of your audience are local to Brisbane and so on, but growing up as a kid, we always hated Redcliffe simply because they won everything. They used to flog every team. They had thousands of juniors. They were a really rich clubs, so we just resented them for their success.
Yep.
And then I went to the Redcliffe Dolphins and played a year there. And what do you think happened? We won everything. And I loved it.
You're the enemy.
Yeah, I loved it. I laughed at everybody that hated us because we won everything. So it's funny how things change like that.
So you're down. So are you down at the Roosters when you get picked for the Junior Roos in 2002?
Yeah. So that next year after Redcliffe, I'd moved down and as an 18-year-old, and we played in the Jersey Flegg comp that year, under 20s. We had Dean Pay as the coach. A couple other guys went on to play first grade. Joe Williams, Lapini Payer, Ian Henderson, a couple of guys like that.
Yep.
We just had a great year. Went on. The Dragons were the red hot favourites all year. They had Brett White and Dean Young and a couple of guys in their team. I think they only lost one game leading into the grand final, and that was against us.
Yep.
And then we beat them with a field goal in the dying minutes on grand final day. So Junior Roos followed after that.
So in that Junior Roos side, you mentioned some great players that coming through at the Roosters and of course against your number one arch rivals that year in the Dragons. But that Junior Roos squad, some of the names here: Cameron Smith, John Thurston, Luke Lewis, Anthony Watmow, Greg Bird, and Willie Tonga. It's not a bad squad because you compare that to some other Junior Roos sides, and look, if you make a Junior Kangaroos team, you're a gun. But if you look back in hindsight at some of the years, some of the guys don't get through, and some other years, some teams have a few more players. But were you guys aware at the time that you had all these, superstars in the making, or was it just kind of, just all, hit you and just, I'm playing for the Kangaroos, or was it all just, part of the process of being a young football player getting ready for first grade?
Yeah, I guess we all knew we had a good side, but when you're that age, a lot of people, and thankfully, a lot of people remind you that not many players actually kick on and convert into being, regular first grade players and so on. Because there's a few of us there that hadn't even played first grade. There's a few guys that started early, but yeah, we didn't realise obviously that, probably, what was it, 8-10 years later, a lot of us were going to be playing in a proper Kangaroo side together. And then another 5 or 6 years later, there's some guys retiring, like JT and Smithy, if Smithy ever retires, but JT, who will probably be future immortals. So, yeah, we didn't realise all that at the time, but it is cool thinking about that old team. And I know Greg Bird and JT and myself have exchanged that photo of the junior Kangaroos a couple of times, just going, holy shit, do you remember how good that team was? And we had such a good time over in Papua New Guinea playing their national team that we still got really good memories from back in those days.
And some of those hairdos from the mid-2000s and the early 2000s, just in general. Like, I personally, myself, I was 18 in 2004, and I look back at some photos. I don't know how we got away with some of those things, but it was the same for football players, and I'm sure you've had a couple of dudes in your time too. I think when you were at the Roosters, did you have a little ratty going on for a while there as well?
I had a mullet.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't a rat style?
Well, living in Sydney at that time, the mullet sort of came back into fashion as a trendy thing. Wasn't just a Western Sydney country style bogan thing. It was it was like inner city trendy to have one of those. So not sure how I ended up with it, but I did. And yeah, I think it was last year in the Heritage Round or something. They played all these highlights everywhere of different games, and I popped up with my mullet, and I think me and Shannon Heggie were having a fight, and Shannon punched holes into me, and that was one topic of conversation. The other topic was my mullet. So yeah,
it's good to be remembered for something, David.
Yeah, well, I was 22 at the time, and thought I was cool and bulletproof. So it's funny looking back on it now.
And the other thing too, and I guess I don't know how much you've spoken about this. You may have. Coming down to the Roosters when you did, and I still class this Roosters team of about, I guess you could say 2000 onwards, because they made the 2000 grand final. But when Ricky Stewart kind of came in, and that Iron Curtain defence, and how ruthless the Roosters were, and the outside backs, and the squad itself, from about 2002 through to 2004, basically, that 3-year period where they could have done a triple. What was it like coming in to a squad, I would imagine at the time, which had coaches for things that were way ahead of their time? I think they had a referees coach at one point in Bill Harrigan. What was it like walking into that system?
Oh, it's phenomenal. So that first year in 2002, so we won the Jersey Flegg Grand Final, first grade. They won their grand final against the Warriors. So the club was just on a massive high, just had brimming with talent. And I got to go into the full-time squad that following year, 2003. Yep. They were trying to go back-to-back. Over those years, they also had some incredible coaches. That obviously had Dean Pay, Ivan Cleary, John Cartwright, Shane Flanagan, all backing up Ricky. So an all-star lineup of coaches. And then the players too. I think at one stage there was about 13 rep players out of the 17 in first grade. Guys that probably don't get enough of a mention, like Mick Crocker and Chris Flannery and those sorts of guys. Yep. They were just fearless and ruthless out in that field. And then of course my favourite was Adrian Morley.
Of course,
He was someone who had a big impact on my career, because I unfortunately had another knee reco when I was 19, 20, probably 20 I think I was, and Ronnie Palmer, the great Ronnie Palmer, during my recovery, he goes, Schiller, they don't come much more athletic and physical than Big Mozza, Adrian Morley. So I want you to just partner up with him. Whatever he does, you do. So, and Mozza is just a great bloke who took me under his wing, and in the gym we pumped iron together, and then out in the field, he's really athletic, Moz, and I just try to keep up with him in all the different fitness drills and agility drills we're doing.
Mm.
And then as a result of that, I got to debut that next year. So everything he did off the field, I want to emulate, and then everything on the field too, with his aggression and dominance, I did my best to emulate that as well.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because this afternoon I put an article up on the 81stminute.com, the most fearsome hitmen in the history of the game, and I put Morley number one.
Yeah.
But I guess, and Ben Cross and I were speaking about this in episode 7, about Morley and the fact that, yes, he was a scary, scary human being, I would assume, to play against, but the things that he could do with the lines he would run, off a first, off the dummy half, or a halfback. He wasn't silly with his lines either. He was a very, very smart player, and like you said, agility wise, you had to be that agile to make as many hits and get to as many tackles as Adrian Morley did.
Yeah, he had really short, sharp footwork. A lot of us, including myself, the taller guys, really long strides, and we changed direction a bit slower and so on. And there was always a thing of mine to try and shorten up my feet, whether I was trying to generate speed or be more agile, or come in when an attacker's coming in close to you. They always say shorten up your feet a bit so you can move a bit more nimbly.
Yep.
And Mozza was like that all the time. When he ran the ball, he had short, sharp steps and changed direction well, and he was just fast. Because he wasn't the heaviest bloke as far as props goes. I think he was only around that 105 mark, which is kind of light for a prop. But he made up for it with speed and obviously aggression. So yeah, he was pretty damaging.
Now, obviously, he was a leader on the field, and he led by his actions. Did he say too much in the dressing rooms, or was that left to people like Brad Fittler to get messages across to the team?
Yeah, no, he didn't say too much at all, Big Moz. But he reacted well. He was very loyal. Wanted to pump up the boys by his actions, and I know a few times Ricky challenged Mozza in front of everybody, and was like, "Are you going to step up against so and so in the opposite team?" Whether that was in training leading into a game or at halftime, and all of a sudden Mozza's eyes would glaze over or roll back in his head, and some poor fellow on the opposition's been taken out. So he loved performing his role for the team, and he was highly admired by the rest of us.
And I guess in the very modern game, and we're talking the last couple of years, when you talk about, I guess, rivals, and I guess it goes in cycles too, right? When squads, they come and go, and teams get to the absolute pinnacle for a few years, and I guess we saw that for several years between the Broncos and Cowboys. But being there yourself and watching the Roosters-Bulldogs rivalry in that 2002 to, say, 2004, 2005 period, which we spoke about before, in my head, that period there, and that was legitimate Friday night games. That's back when the best game of the round was always the Friday night game. What was it like being part of the Roosters club when you knew you were coming up against Canterbury? Because to me, those games in the premiership rounds were just a tick higher in intensity and everything else than in any other game you'd see during the year.
Yeah, that was one of the big things, and people have often ask, what was it like playing for different clubs, the feeling of it, because I also obviously played for the Raiders and Titans, and one of the key differences was the Roosters being such a high-profile, headline-grabbing, bums-on-seats sort of team.
Yep.
They had really high-profile players, and at most times were playing good footy and winning games, and so that was a big difference. The Roosters it was so intense, so high profile. There was always big games like that. So there's Bulldogs games for sure. The other ones I remember were the Broncos games. They used to play every Good Friday.
Yep.
And we used to get huge crowds for that. And I always remember Big Petro and all them running down and at the SFS, and us doing our best to stop them. And so yeah, some great rivalries there. Rivals. One of the worst, unfortunately, was obviously with the Rabbitohs, the local derby. And my first year in first grade, it was like my second or third game in the top grade. And unfortunately, we lost to the Rabbitohs, which was the first time in, I think, 11 years at the time.
They weren't much chop back then, were they?
No, the Rabbitohs had beat in the local derby, so it's not good to be holding one of those records, that's for sure.
So we'll go back to 2005, and that's a nice segue, David. Your debut is you're starting, and some of these episodes we've done, I guess a couple of the older blokes like Phil Daly and Pat Jarvis, we talk about their bench, their first game, coming off the bench. But I guess it was a little bit different back then, where I guess you play reserve grade, you come off at half time or whatever, and you might get 10 minutes of the last 10 minutes of the game. Webkey, I think, was the same in episode 1. But you were starting jumper 2005 against the Panthers. And at the time, too, you spoke about the Bulldogs and the Broncos. 2005, it's only a couple of years removed from the grand final in 2003, which you guys went down in, unfortunately. But what was it like starting and knowing for the week, I guess, that you were about to pack down with, I guess, a hero of yours in Morley, Craig Wing, Craig Fitzgibbon, Anthony Tupou, and going up against blokes like Joel Clinton, Frank Pritchard, Luke Prudis, Waterhouse, and Joe Nullivow? Can you remember that game?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously a pretty special game, and I think the reason why I was starting really is just that was Ricky Stewart's coaching style.
Okay.
He just thought, throw me in there with like anyone like me is debuting, throw him in there, get the nervous energy out of the way early on, and their enthusiasm, make it be a bit more like catchy, so the boys feed off it, and that sort of thing, rather than sitting on the bench getting nervous and burning all your nervous energy. So that's definitely Ricky Stewart's style. But I do remember. There's a mixture of feelings of a little bit of relief, I guess, that you're actually playing a game of first grade after all these years of trying.
Yeah, and the injuries you had too.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. When I had that second knee reco as roughly a 20-year-old, the Roosters had actually told me they weren't going to resign me, and I was staring down the barrel of moving back home to Queensland, and with a bit of a failed attempt, I guess, of moving to Sydney to play first grade footy. And then as I mentioned, I started training with Adrian Morley and turned things around to get to this Panthers debut. And so this was a fair bit of satisfaction or relief there, I guess, in that. But then there's the nerves, I guess, of thinking, I was playing all right in reserve grade, but first grade and reserve grade are two different beasts. Yeah. And how am I going to handle this? And as you say, there's all-star forwards for that Penrith team, and they weren't. It wasn't long after the grand final, so they're a pretty intimidating team to play. But once again, Ricky, as a coach, he puts a lot of confidence in you, a lot of faith in you, and make sure you definitely know what your role is as far as dominating that other pack and getting the team forward. So Ricky was great as a coach in that respect, and guys like Craig Wing, he was always behind me when I was playing the ball. Yep. He was fantastic. Wingy would always pull me aside and say, pump me up to get the quickest play the ball as I could, so he could scoot out from behind me. And whenever I put our team on the front foot with a quick play the ball, he was the first to be backslapping me and pumping me up and thanking me for it. So a few of those guys really made me feel comfortable out there. And I do remember, I think I bent over a little bit early, and Joel Clinton might have steamrolled me at one stage, and I tried to make a name for myself and shoulder charge Ben Ross, and I missed him, I think. So not everything went to plan, but thankfully I stuck in there for a few more games after.
Well, it makes sense too with what you mentioned about Ricky Stewart in your first year. You play 5 games in that first season, and you start in all 5. You come back for 2006, and of the 24 games you play, David, you start in 20 of them. So was this a little bit different coming back with that full preseason under your belt? You've got the taste of first grade. You've done it 5 times starting. Was there a message from Ricky Stewart in that preseason leading into 2006 saying, was Ricky still there then?
Yeah.
He was still there then? Yeah.
Yep.
So did Ricky have a message for you individually, or was it like, okay, you know your role, you're going to step up now, you're going to be one of our leaders of our pack?
Yeah, that's what he was like, Ricky, and I certainly appreciated it. That he didn't sort of. I mean, leading into getting picked in first grade, I remember my mindset was, hey, I'm in reserve grade now. I want to be starting front rower, and then I want to be the best front rower in reserve grade, so that if there's an injury or poor form in first grade, I'm the next cat off the rank to get picked. Getting picked in first grade, Ricky basically said, look, you're our best option at the moment. I want you to own it. It's yours. I'm giving it to you until you lose it. So don't lose it. And then starting me the next year, all those games, a big part of it for him was, what he said to me when I got the role. He said, "This is your role now, so own it." And he always had a theory that you're not a real first grader until you played X amount of games. I think it was 100 games, first grade.
Yep.
And that was like the breaking in period, so to speak. So he just wanted to fast track me through that and progress my career as quick as I could, so I could be that dominant front rower that every club needed, and the Roosters obviously needed at the time as well.
And you come along at an interesting time, particularly at the club, because you're right on the cusp of being a first grader when the Roosters, I guess you're still developing at that time, but you get there at the back end of that amazing Roosters period that I was speaking about. And I guess for every club, when you go through that much success, naturally you lose players, whether it's through retirement or players, they take the money elsewhere because now clubs are chasing this premiership team, and things kind of change pretty quickly with the salary cap and the way the rugby league works. In 2007, you start all 21 of the games you play in. But could you see that the club was changing and kind of, I guess, dipping a little bit? Because 2005, 9th, which is fair enough because you guys have been up for so long. Then 14th and 10th. Was it hard for yourself playing so much football as a young bloke, as a starting front rower? Did you feel like there was unfair pressure on you at all, seeing the team slide, which is obviously not your fault, and you're coming into first grade as the team's kind of on the back end of this amazing run?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it was unfair. It is what it is. But it was exactly like that. I know I came in 2005, 5 rounds to go in that season, and as everyone knows, they won in 02, runners up in 3 and 4. So 05, those last 5 games, we had to win every game to try and keep our finals hopes alive. Yeah. So I didn't want to be a part of the team, obviously, that didn't make the finals after all this time of success. I didn't want to be in that team that lost to the Rabbitohs after 11 years of beating them. But that's just the way it was. And we played our guts out. But a lot of players had left by then that were key players, I guess. Yep. And we're talking about people like Brad Fittler. Obviously, any team with Brad Fittler in it is a remarkable team. And he just had so much influence and control over games. When he wanted to just run it close to the line, he put a big step on and just charge over and score. That's what he could do. So missing him was a big thing. It's kind of like Darren Lockyer leaving the Broncos. So, and then Luke Rickerson was retiring, and a couple other guys were injured or retiring, and there's a real changing of the guard in that 05-06 period. Unfortunately, Ricky didn't survive as the coach that year because we just didn't perform. A lot of players didn't survive as well. Chris Anderson came as a coach, and it was a bit of a failed experiment where he was awesome, Chris, as a bloke, and had some good things as a coach, but as a team, we just didn't respond and gel properly. But then Freddie came in halfway through 07, and Freddie really turned us around a lot. I really loved him as a coach. He taught me a lot about a front rower's role, about ownership of that role and dominance and that sort of thing. And we went on a bit of a winning streak, and we drew a couple of games and won a bunch of games at the back of 07 to almost make the finals after barely winning a game early in the year. And then my last year at the Roosters, 08, we were top of the table for most of that year with Freddie as the coach. We'd recruited bloody half the Bulldogs team, and we ended up finishing 4th and dropped out after second round of the finals. And that was a good year for the club, of course. But it was definitely a change in the guard period when I was there.
And just as you were speaking then, David, just some things popped into my head, and I just want to get some really quick comments from you. Some crazy things that I remember, and if you can like tell me how it really was. Chris Anderson with the 1 marker rule, was that was him?
Yeah. I not maybe it was going to be a genius play, maybe it wasn't, but I remember I was injured a lot of the preseason, and I came back to the squad training, and I went to go second marker during one of the opposed drills, and they're like, no, 1 marker. And I was like, what are you talking about? and 1 marker. I went, you're kidding? But I think it's just going to run straight behind the ruck every time. And then round 1 and 2, that's exactly what they did before we scrapped it. So bit of a failed experiment, but I'm sure Chris has had plenty of others that were winners.
Oh, of course, and he's one of the greatest coaches, not just a great player in his own right, but obviously won premierships as a coach at Canterbury and the Melbourne Storm. Two within 5 years, something like that. Ridiculous. So the other ones from that period both include Freddie, and one of them was a blow up about Freddie eating a sandwich in the coach's box while the game was on, which is absolutely ridiculous. That the sandwich is there, the coach should be able to eat it. But the other one, right. David, the other one is Braithen Nasser at fullback.
Oh yeah, yep.
Now everyone loves Freddie, but that's a very Freddie call, is it not?
Yeah, and you know what? Freddie had a lot of those calls that worked out well, a lot that didn't, and we see him with that same sort of influence or quirkiness in this Blues team that he's been coaching the last couple of years. People are bloody rolling their eyes and raising their eyebrows, going, "Why are they walking around on the grass with no shoes on? Shoes on? What the hell's grounding?"
Yeah.
But look at the Blues team; they've come out and smashed Queensland, unfortunately, the last couple of years. So I think if anyone can eat a if anyone can eat a sandwich in the coach's box, it's probably Freddie, and he probably didn't have his shoes on at the same time, I reckon.
You mentioned the plays that came across as well. Now, coming from just a few years before that, blokes like Willie Mason, Mark O'Mealy, Nate Miles, Braithen Astor were public enemy number one at the Roosters. Not just the players, but the fans as well. I guess there was that rivalry where it's, even though it was still, within the last 20 years, it was still kind of, to me, like an old school rivalry. Like, you don't talk to them during the week, and if you do have to talk to them, do it on your own time kind of thing, whatever. There wasn't social media really then. I mean, I guess there was MySpace back then, something like that, and emails, and I guess. But all of a sudden, the Roosters, they come off this a couple of poor seasons by their standards, and all of a sudden, like you mentioned, you got half the Canterbury team at Bondi. How did that dynamic change, or was it smooth enough because everyone was professionals?
It was fairly smooth, and as I mentioned, it was a changing of the guard anyway, I guess. Yeah. So it wasn't like we cleaned out a whole bunch of regular guys, big names or anything like that, to bring in the Bulldogs fellas. But you're right, like they were huge names back then, and Willie, Mark O'Mealy, and Milesy. So I think unfortunately, Mark and Willie, they're probably past their sort of peak playing time at that stage. So we didn't get the best out of them, or the most out of them like we should have, I guess. So it didn't pay off for the Roosters like it could have. Milesy, he was still quite young at the time and played a fair bit of footy and a lot of his rep footy while he's still at the Roosters. And so he was good to have around the club. But I know for me, it added an extra element of a challenge for me, because I was a front row, second row sort of person at the time, and competing with these sort of blokes for a spot in the team, and that was a bit of a catalyst for me to actually move to the Raiders after that year in 2008, because I was really wanting to cement a starting first grade spot and play plenty of minutes, but with those sort of guys in rotation with you, it's pretty hard to sort of get good minutes on the field. So massive signings, and it wasn't a huge disruption, but for me, it probably led to me moving down to the Raiders.
But funny you mention that, because by this stage you'd probably played 60 plus first grade games.
Yeah.
So you were firmly entrenched as a first grade front rower, and I don't know what Queensland's system was back then, but I'm sure the Maroons in one way or another were in contact with you saying, keep this going. Was there development squads for the Queensland teams back then as well?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's funny. So probably Milesy coming to the Bulldogs, Nate Miles, was probably the reason why I ended up going to Canberra. For a couple of reasons. In one, I had to compete with him at the Roosters, but he was in the Origin team at the time. Neil Henry was the coach, assistant coach, next to Mel there, and Miles would come back from Origin camp and go, "Mate, that Neil Henry, he is a smart football brain." And at the time, Neil was down at Canberra, and he just got those Raiders boys firing. They went on a bit of a winning streak there in 2008. Terry Campese and a few other boys came onto the scene. And anyway, so the Raiders sounded me out about a contract, and with Milesy talking about Neil Henry being such a good coach, I thought, well, what the hell? Let's go down there.
Why not?
So that year as well, I got to be the 18th man in for the Queensland team.
Yep.
So 2008. So I was sort of starting to get into the mix, I guess, in the calculations of Origin. But then moving down to Canberra, after I'd signed, Neil actually took a job up at the Cowboys. But then Dave Ferner got announced as coach, and Fernsey was one of my favourite players as a kid.
I was about to bring that up.
Yeah, I was a bit of a second rower as a kid and wore headgear and this sort of stuff. And so I was like, oh, Dave Ferner sounds pretty good anyway. And obviously stuck to the plan and went down there and played some good footy under him.
Now, was it a major eye-opener to you? Now, Canberra, with all respect to them, they've done amazing things. They've opened a excuse me. They've opened a centre of excellence, which I think they've just been able to reopen this week with the COVID-19 stuff being relaxed a little bit for the football teams. But back then, I guess they were a team, and my brother's a Canberra fan, so I've heard everything about Canberra for since the 90s and since he started being a Raiders fan. And they were always a battling team. They were always on the cusp. They would never beat themselves. They were and like you said, they had a good 2008. They had some good players coming through in 2009. But what was it like going from the Roosters, and how we just touched on, they had coaches for everything, and then you get to Canberra and it's a little bit of a different setup, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Oh, geez, it's chalk and cheese, the two setups, that's for sure. A lot of people, for them, Canberra's off the radar, and whilst they did have a good back end of the season in 2008, they hadn't had really good years for a long time then, and so yeah, definitely not a high profile club. Definitely no real big names and rep players really. And then the town itself, of course, I went from a 2-bedroom unit in Clovelly in the eastern suburbs of Sydney at ocean views, down to a 1-bedroom unit by myself. Only knew one other player, Nigel Plum, and I looked out over across the road to another government building. So that was my view rather than the beach.
Lovely.
So it was a bit of a shock, and in that first year as well, in the first season, I remember we had sleet smashing us in the face trying to warm up for a game versus the Bulldogs, and another time it snowed the day before the game when we were trying to do captain's run, and so yeah, it wasn't like the life I had in Sydney where I'd come home after training and walk down to the beach and run into a heap of mates and go swimming and hang out in the sun. It wasn't like that at all. But yeah, look, it grew on me, the town. We had some good years. Performance-wise, a couple of years we went through the finals there and did all right for ourselves without sort of going all the way. And for my own personal footy, I got to play a heap of rep footy while I was down there as well. So definitely no complaints. And if anyone ever asks me, oh, should I sign with the Raiders and go down there? Absolutely. You can just concentrate on your footy, lay low and get the most out of your career, that's for sure.
And I guess too with Ricky Stewart, and you know this too, working with him at the Roosters. I mean, he's the kind of bloke, from all reports, and other people have told me this, that he's dead set keen on everyone getting together, making sure they have a beer. He's that old school bloke, and the town itself kind of galvanise around that when they're winning. And I think even those players, that when you go there, it doesn't matter where you're from, whether you're John Bateman from the north of England or Dave Shillington, Brisbane via Clovelly, once you get there, because there's, with all due respect to the town itself, there isn't as much to do, and the weather may not be as good, that you kind of have to bond together and play good football. Otherwise, what's the point?
No, you're absolutely right. And if you're a boring person, Canberra's a boring place. There is plenty of stuff to do there. Sometimes you have to drive out of town and do it. So things like fishing and surfing down the south coast and the snowfields, of course. So there's plenty of action in and around Canberra. But yeah, look, the weather is pretty awful at times, and there isn't sometimes there isn't a lot to do during your day. So you end up hanging out at the cafes and each other's houses and drinking coffee and spending time together way more than you would otherwise. And so some of my good mates from back in the day there, Sean Fensom and Tom Leroy Lars and Dane Tills and Joe Picker, all the guys I used to play with. Because we were bored before training or it was cold outside, we just meet up at the cafe 2 hours before training started and sit there for an hour drinking coffee and chatting and hanging out. So yeah, a lot of us had a really close, tight bond there because of those conditions, and I've got a lot of good mates as a result of it as well.
So you spoke about your representative debuts in 2009, David, Queensland and Australia, and you cap it off and you go on the Four Nations tour to the United Kingdom. Had you played in the UK before going over there?
No, I tagged along to a World Club Challenge in '03.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
After the
There you go.
Roosters won the grand final in '02. So I didn't play, sorry. So yeah, you'd have to research well to remember this one. But I was 18th man for the World Club Challenge in '03. So I warmed up with the team and everything. And I'll always remember that trip because I remember Brad Fittler bloody nosedived it when he was getting tackled, and the ground was just rock hard because it was icy cold.
Yeah.
It was like frozen the ground, and he busted his head open that badly. He had to get about a dozen staples in his head. So I was still only 18 at the time, or 19, I think I was, and going, oh my gosh, this is senior footy, eh? Yeah, otherwise, yeah, that was my first trip over there in the '09 Four Nations tour, and yeah, it was bloody good. Got to play a couple of games for the Kangaroos and enjoy myself at the same time.
And 2010 comes around pretty quickly, particularly when you go on a tour. You're back in pre-season, the trials start and bang, new season. 2010, it's a really good year for Canberra. You make the finals. You don't just, I guess you slide in 7th, but you make it to week 2 of the semis, and Canberra goes into meltdown. It's the ground's sold out. There's lines a kilometre down outside the stadium trying to get tickets. It's a huge week leading up. It's against the West Tigers. And that is a game, if you look back on it, and you say you're still close to a number of your former Raiders teammates, is that a game that gets brought up in conversation that maybe you guys should have won that game? Because it's a cracking game of football.
It was, yeah. The town was abuzz. Like, it was crazy. Everyone was talking about it all week long, and the tickets sold out. It was the biggest crowd since, I think, Melbourne Ingers last game, and it was a sensational game of footy. Those big games, you remember the things you do individually, like yourself personally, that you wish you could have done better. I remember one time I could have pushed up on the inside and stopped this inside ball that went through for a try, and I was like, imagine if I'd made that tackle, if I wasn't that little bit lazy, would the game have turned out differently? Who knows? But one of the other reasons why we talk about that game is Sean Fenson was a young first grader at the time as well, who ended up playing a fair bit of footy for the Raiders. And he likes, every time we have a beer together, he likes to bring this up, that in the opening minutes of that game, I actually was rucking the ball up, and I turned, the Tigers boys sprinting off the line, put pressure on me. I turned and passed the ball to Fenno. He thinks I lobbed it, but I think the pass was fine. And then as he put his hands up to catch the ball, I think it was Bryce Gibbs or Liam Fulton, one of those Tigers boys, hit him straight in the ribs there. And turns out it was one of those hospital balls, because he actually went to hospital. And he had
a legitimate one.
Yeah, so he had a ruptured spleen or something, and it put him out of Mad Monday celebrations and end of season drinks for the whole week, and he sat in hospital by himself, the poor fella. So
that's a shame.
He likes to rib me about that now, and doesn't let me forget it. That's for sure.
And look, I'm a West Tigers fan, so I will say that. But I guess it was bittersweet to see, and he has now turned into what I think is not only one of the most underrated players of all time, but one of the greatest Canberra Raiders players to play for the club in Jared Croker. I think he missed a goal to either win it or send it into overtime. Is that right?
Yeah, he had the opportunity to win it, and he missed it, unfortunately. So, actually, I think it was to go in overtime. Yeah, it would have been a very impactful in the game anyway. And unlike him, he didn't get it that day, and he's one of the best goal kickers in the comp. So, if anyone was going to get it, it was him, but it just wasn't his day, unfortunately.
And what I was trying to get is one of the great blokes of rugby league, and not nice to see a win like that, but we went down the next week anyway, so it doesn't matter. Look, another thing I want to talk about is your Origin appearances. You play 8 games, and if you ask any Queensland footy fan growing up, any rugby league tragic from north of the border, if someone said to you, by the time you're retired, you will have played in 8 State of Origins spanning from 2009 to 13, which just so coincides with the greatest rugby league team, arguably, apart from the 11 straight Dragons of the 50s and 60s, to ever play the game and to play with some of the greatest players to ever play the game. What would you have said if someone told you that?
Yeah, you certainly, you wouldn't have believed him, and yeah, would have felt like a bit of a dream, and like, yeah, it was great to be a part of that team for all those years and all those wins, but just playing the one game is just phenomenal too. So, and I like, just so many things came to mind when I was putting on the jersey and running out there, and I remember being a kid, parking myself in front of the TV 10 minutes before kickoff, so I didn't miss that first return of the kickoff ball. And we used to talk about it, my brothers and I, my mates at school, would say, imagine running that ball back off the kickoff. That other opposition team is fresh and just wanting blood and just screaming down the field at you. That is the toughest run anyone could take in the game of footy.
Yep.
So then to actually line up to return that ball off the kickoff, I was thinking about, kids who might be thinking that and what we used to think. And then also, yeah, like you say, this support in Queensland for the Maroons is just, it's amazing. Everyone gets behind it. And that was game 3, 2009, my debut. In game 2, we had a bye round for the Raiders, and Fernsey gave us the week off. So I came up to the Gold Coast where my brother Johnny was living, and I watched the game with him and his friends. Johnny was a rugby league fanatic himself, and had about 4 or 5 mates over, and sitting around the lounge room having a beer and some pizza, and all of his mates, including John, all had Maroons jerseys on with their names written on the back. And it wasn't in support of me. I'd played in the Origin at the time. It was just in support of the Maroons in general.
Yeah.
And I think the Maroons got off to a start in that game and maybe scored the first try. And my brother Johnny and all his mates were jumping up Yahoo and running around the lounge room, just so happy the Maroons were getting up. So, yeah, remembering things like that, how much it means to the state, how much it means to the kids, that makes playing Origin extra special.
And when you did get to play your first game, I guess it's sentimental for me to ask, did you have time before kick-off to think about playing in the backyard with your brother Johnny and your other brothers, and growing up being a tragic football fan? Or is it just your eyes are rolling, you don't have time for anything, before you know it, you're out in the field? What was it like playing your first game?
Well, it's a big week, actually. So you get those moments to think about your family and what it means. Yeah, absolutely. But then there's so much atmosphere, and people will always say that who've been to an Origin game and played one, if you're a fan or a player, and the biggest thing people talk about is the atmosphere. And I remember in that week trying to learn all the different set plays we had, all the moves from taps and scrums and 20-meter restarts, and there was a big playbook. There was the big Artie move, the 4X move, and all these different moves, and some of them involved all 13 players on the field at that time.
Really?
Yeah. So it's pretty
I
complicated.
bet you New South Wales weren't doing that.
Maybe not. Well, we were in a fortunate position where a lot of the boys were getting picked year after year, and so Smithy, JT, Cooper, Lockie, they all knew each other's plays and style back to front. Yeah. So when they went into camp, it was business as usual, and they could just continue on from where they left off. But for me, it was my first game, and I didn't want to be that traditional dumb front row or anything like that. So I make sure I studied hard all that week and learned all the plays and what each play was when they called it. But unfortunately, then you run out in the field and it's so noisy.
I was about to ask you that. Can you hear the calls on the field?
Yeah, so fans screaming, wanting blood over the sideline and cheering their team on. That you get out there and you might be like 2 passes off the ruck, and Smitty looks up and calls a play, and all you can see is his mouth moving. And then Cooper turns to you and says the same play to relay it along, and you can't hear him either. But then as soon as Smitty jumped out of dummy half, and I think it might have been Benny Hannett dropped under him, I went, oh, that's the big Artie play, rightio. And so it sort of became second nature, and I knew to drop under Cooper, and then I remember we scored off one of those. I think it was Justin Hodges scored off one of those plays, and I was like, wow, all 13 players in the one move, and we scored, so it was definitely worth it. So I'm glad that sort of second nature kicked in, so you couldn't hear a thing.
And you talk about your debut in 2009. You start alongside a bloke called Steve Price, who is a legend of the game. You play your last game in 13 alongside another bloke called Matt Scott. I guess it's a different feeling talking about your first Origin because you know it's coming. You can soak it in, like you said, during the week. You remember everything of the game. But then I guess in State of Origin and rep football in general, you don't know when your last game's coming. So is it different talking about your last game because you didn't know it was your last? And at the time, you don't know when your last game's coming, do you? You don't know what's around the corner. You just think everything's going well. Is it a different feeling talking about your last game in 13? Or is it you look back on it fondly anyway?
Obviously, you try and feel as fortunate as you can about it. But at the same time, you just wish you played so many more as well.
Yeah.
Not getting picked after that last game was really disappointing. I've actually still got my bag packed from that game.
Really?
My kit bag, because I came home from the camp and not assumed, but hoped I'd be there for game 2.
Yeah.
And then, because that was game 1, 2013, and then Mel called me the next week and just said, "Oh, look, we're going to drop yourself and Ash Harrison and bring in 2 fresh guys. Look, it's not, we're not pinning the loss on you guys, but we might need a couple of fresh faces in, and you're not ruled out for future selections and so on." And so Mel was good about it. Had to make that call, and I just had to accept it and try and play my best to get back in there. But yeah, I never got to use that kit bag again, and it's just still packed with all the gear from that camp and everything, and sitting in my storage room.
So Kevin Walters, if you're listening, if needed, Dave Shillington's ready to go. Have you looked back in it, or have you just left it?
No, I've never watched that game, but I do remember
the bag. Have you looked back into the bag?
Oh, the bag. Yeah, a couple of times.
Yeah.
Because I've got my 2 kids now. My son, he's about to turn 5, and he's starting to understand football and the different teams and so on, and that I played a bit. So yeah, we've rifled through the old gear a couple of times, and he asked you about 1,000 questions. So it's nice to reminisce.
So you're doing podcasts every day with your son anyway.
It's pretty much like
Q&As.
That. He's got to a stage where he loves fishing, surfing, and football, which is not a bad thing. It's all the things I like too. So he's good company and plenty of fun, actually, my young fella.
Now, I want to talk about the Gold Coast Titans too, David. Now, you spoke about you had 2 knee recos before first grade?
Yeah, yep.
So you had 2. Now, I don't in my research, and I think your retirement when it was announced at the Gold Coast at the back end there, when you did retire, it was cited that you had 9 surgeries in 12 years. Did that include the 2 knee recos before first grade as well?
I think, yeah, I included that. So I ended up having 10 rounds of surgery, I guess.
Okay.
Because when I retired, I had a 10th one just to finish off. Yeah, I speak to young kids at footy clubs regularly, and I talk about injuries a lot because it was a big part of my career, unfortunately, but fortunately as well, because it sort of teaches you to be, quite sort of stoic and understand that, look, it's not the end of the world. You just need to make a plan and lean on people around you, ask for support around you, or people who've been there and done it before, and how do they recover? What good and bad things do they do? And there's always a way to come back, and there's always a way to get better. And so I sort of learnt so much from all those injuries, even though they were massive setbacks. And in my last year at the Titans there, I had my shoulder recoat again, and my hand, the thumb joint in my hand fused. So, which was actually, to be honest, fantastic once again, because I was in so much pain with my shoulder and my thumb that finishing my career and having those 2 rounds of surgery actually felt like a real relief. I was really sick of being injured, sick of being in pain, not being able to play my best footy because you have to hold back in different ways. So, and at night time you try and sleep, but you roll over and you're in pain, or you shake hands with someone, you're in pain. And so yeah, it was kind of rubbish that you get injured so many times, but then when you have those final rounds of surgery, it's such a relief.
We saw a couple of years ago, and the young West Tigers Polynesian boy, his name escapes me, but we saw some mental health demons come into the game a little bit, where I think he took his own life.
Yeah, yeah.
And he came back from a few injuries. He got injured again. That pressure on young blokes is the pressure on kids coming through today. Maybe more from the outside than the club itself, but is the pressure on kids coming through now more than say when you got your injuries before first grade? Was it a different pressure than today for these kids?
It was different for me back then. It was easier for me, I'd say, because the environment's changed so much. So when I was a 14, 15-year-old and had my first knee reco, so that was in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, when teams started training for full time.
Yep.
First grade teams, it was actually it was a job to play football.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember talking to my brother, going, "Wow, do you know that people get paid just to play football, and that's all they do for work? That would be hilarious. Imagine you could do that." And so it was never a career option. But now, moving forward, and like for that young West Tigers player, it was probably a career option for him, as it is for all other young people coming through now. So there's a different amount of pressure and emotional and financial attachment to that. And I guess to add to that, we didn't have social media back then as well.
Exactly.
And young people today that have grown up in the social media age, or whatever you say, they're really used to putting everything out there for people to see, seeking approval or judgment, and chatting and displaying all their life that way. So they're really connected to what other people think of them, and that stuff like that. So when something goes wrong, I think it just feels a whole lot worse for people, because I guess their circle is so much bigger through social media. Whereas for me, it would have been just my mum and dad and my brothers and a couple of close mates that would have known had an Enrico. But for these young people coming through, it kind of feels like the whole world knows your ups and downs, and when the downs happen, it's a whole lot worse for you.
So we're on the Titans now, and in 2016, obviously we've touched on the fact that you've had your own injury battles, I guess, throughout your career. It's a good start to the season. You play 7 of the first 8 games for the Gold Coast. You're back for round 10. Then there's a big gap there to around 22. But you finish the season round 22, 23, 24. And then I think you announced your retirement in February the following year, which is unfortunate, mate. But it sounds like everything just caught up on you. But I just want to quickly, before I let you just touch on your retirement and how it all came about with the Gold Coast. And I'm sure you've seen this yourself, David. When a player retires, you'll see a press release that goes on the club's website, and it's all very generic things from the coach and the CEO or the football manager. But I read the Titans press release when you retired, and this comes from Graham Annesley, who is one of the not just one of the nicest blokes in rugby league, but one of the brightest minds and smartest blokes in the game. He was the CEO of the Titans at the time. He said, "There are many quality people in our game, and David Shillington is one of the best." That doesn't sound like a club just putting out a press release for any bum. What was it like, unfortunately, going up the Gold Coast and having a plan in mind of what you want to do for the club to put them back on the map after a strong start about 10 years before that for the Titans, and then it all kind of, unfortunately, like a lead balloon, February training, having to retire and not being able to get back on the field for the new season?
Yeah, nothing really went to plan, unfortunately, going to the Titans, and I don't regret it. It was, I'd been in Sydney and Canberra, away from Queensland, for about 14 years, 7 years in Sydney, 7 years in Canberra. So the Titans signing me, and the fact that I could come home to Queensland and play football and live with my young family I'd had at the stage, that was a dream come true, to be honest. I was like, amazing. I'm moving home. I could see all my old schoolmates regularly, all my family regularly, and live in Queensland. So I don't regret it. The Titans at the time, they'd gone through a couple of years of hell. They had different scandals off the field, from financial issues when Michael Searle finished up, to a cocaine scandal, to all different things. And they'd lost their high performance facility. They got booted from one of the schools they were training at, and so we were just training out of the Burleigh Bears facility, and there was really no, I'd say, big name players at the club except for Greg Bird. but otherwise, yeah, it was a fresh new team. Half the team had been cleaned out 2 years ago, and then another half when I got there. So they were looking to rebuild, and I was meant to be part of that plan as experienced front rower and senior player, and I definitely did my best to perform that way. But I busted my shoulder that second time, and I remember the game where we played the Roosters at Seabus Stadium, and Jared Warrior-Hargreaves and I always had lots of battles on the field, as you do. And there's a couple of minutes to go on the game, and I still hadn't got one on him yet. and so I came up from probably like about four wide in the defensive line and just sprinted across. I remember Birdie talked about actually. He goes, "You just sprinted across in front of me." He's like, "Where did Shilly come from?" And then tried to blindside Hargreaves, and he just saw me out of the corner of his eye, lifted his elbow, and it hit me right in the point of my shoulder next to my pec. And I fractured my clavicle and ripped my pec in half all at the same time. And but unfortunately, when I was getting scans, it didn't show up really well what the issue was.
Yep.
And at the time they said, "Oh, it's just a hematoma, like a cork of bad bruising." And I battled over the next couple of weeks trying to get back on the field straight away.
Yeah.
And it's an awful feeling because Neil Henry thinks I'm just bruised, and I think this is not bruising. I've been in this position before. This is bad.
Yep.
And so I kind of felt like I was
and the doctors can't back you up because they can't find it.
Yeah. And so Neil didn't know any better, of course. So, but I was trying to tell him, I was like, "Mate, this is not right." And about 5 weeks later, I felt another tear in my pec when I was doing a fitness test before the game, and retore some of the scar tissue from the previous injury. And anyway, this carried on for like 12 weeks, as you say. And by the time I came back, I still couldn't do a push-up and wrestle and all sort of thing. I could tuck the ball in my wing and run, but I just couldn't tackle. So I was a bit of a liability out there, and ended up having surgery and just decided to retire, really. I had a bit of an option to go overseas and play in the UK, and a couple other clubs were looking for an extra person on their roster that they were going to bring me down for. And so I probably could have struggled on a little bit, but I would have been just chewing up money and sitting on the sideline, and a bit of a waste of time, to be honest. And I couldn't do that to clubs or myself and my family, and just decided to pull the pin and get my shoulder fixed and my thumb fixed and move into the next phase of my life.
And look, just speaking to you tonight, David, and obviously the clubs you've been at and the reasons why for moving on or whatever, you don't sense me as the bloke that's going to waste anyone's time or take anyone's money. So, look, again, David, like the message from Graham Annesley, it's a fantastic message and a comment to make. Before I'll let you go, and we've done an hour too, David. I did tell you before we went on air, I said it'll go quickly, so we've done
okay.
well. I want to ask you quickly, your hero growing up. You mentioned David Furner. Was he your number one? Was he your number one hero growing up, or did you have a prop or someone else that the poster on the wall?
Yeah, there probably wasn't one person, but there was a bunch of people, and the Raiders. So I was an '83 baby, so like 93, 94, that era. I was 8, 9, 10 years old.
Yep.
So I loved everything about the Raiders. Fernsey, Ruben Wiki, Laurie Daly, all those sort of guys.
It's a freak of a team.
Yeah, and then I got a bit older, and I probably liked Webke and Paul Harrigan, those sorts of fellas. I was a bit of a tackler when I was in my early teens because I hadn't had my growth spurts then, and I was quite small. And I used to like Gary Larson for the Maroons, and a couple other guys there. So it wasn't any one person in particular, but a lot of those guys from the '90s.
Just quickly about Gary Larson, my auntie married his cousin.
Wow!
And there was they lived out at Penrith. So funnily enough, the wedding fell on a Saturday night, and the Bears had just played Penrith at Penrith Park. And I was the biggest rugby league nerd that if my a favourite player walked past and sat down next to me, I'd run away, I'd hide. Yeah. And someone told me Gary Larson was coming to the wedding, and it took me 3 hours just to come up and talk to him, and I couldn't get a word out. And he had that "G'day Curtis, how you going?" And he was just the biggest man I'd ever seen, and he was a legend of the game, and he's very underrated. He played for so long, and he was just a defensive weapon. He got through his meters, and he always showed up. He was just a great player, Larson. But Anyway, we could talk about Gary Larson for another hour, but
Yeah.
just quickly, your toughest opponent.
Oh, yeah. Once again, I don't know if it's anyone in particular, but so many. One of my, I remember 2006 when I played the Broncos and Good Friday. Remember, I took a tap run and I saw Darren Lockyer in front of me, and I thought, I'm going to steamroll this guy. He's a fantastic attacker, awesome leader, but not the strongest defender.
Yep.
And I got a size advantage on him. And then out of nowhere, Tony Carroll popped down in front of me with his concrete enforced shoulder of his, and he absolutely folded me in half.
Yeah.
So I went from thinking I was going to run 40 meters to score to being in a medical room with getting painkilling injections on my hip. So big Tunza, yeah. I don't know what his shoulders are made of, but it's got to be concrete in there somewhere.
He's a freak, an absolute freak. I wish he was a front rower so I could speak to him on the podcast, but unfortunately not. David, thank you very much, mate. You're a gentleman, obviously very well spoken, and you're doing great things in the game post-career. You should be very proud of what you did on the field and just as much what you're doing now. And hopefully we can get you back on to do another podcast, and there's plenty more things to talk about. So thanks for coming on Top of the Props tonight, David.
That sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, mate.